So if you haven't already watched my video about making a homeless application, I suggest you watch that before you do this video. Effectively, I've done a video, the best way to make a homeless application, where I go into quite a lot of detail about how it is you want to do that initial kind of stage to set yourself up for success. And once you've done that, what you're often going to find, it's not the same with every council, but with most councils you will then be brought in or invited in for an interview or an assessment. They might call it different things. Most of the time that's going to be face to face, although after COVID I know some councils still do it via phone, which has pros and cons. And so you're going to have to prepare for this interview. It's often going to be, a couple of weeks away, although it won't always be. It might be quite urgent depending on the circumstances of your situation. And essentially the purpose of that interview, or the main purpose of that interview, is to gather information that the council needs to make a formal, kind of decision about what duties are owed to you. And so it can be very far-reaching. It will definitely cover the 5-part test, which I've covered again in a different video. It will definitely cover an assessment under Section 189 and the relief duty, the personalised housing plan. But really it is, if a cynic would say that it's an opportunity for the council to find out why it is they don't have a duty to house you, or try and almost kind of manufacture information in some cases. And I know that might sound overly suspicious, but I've worked in councils and I kind of see how it works from the other side, and that is sometimes how it works. Sometimes staff are specifically told to break the law. That's just the reality of it. And it can be incredibly intimidating, the whole process, kind of very nerve-wracking. A lot of people say that this stage and this contact with the council, which is actually the worst thing about being homeless overall, which might seem crazy, but that's what people consistently say, is how they're treated by the council officer. And I guess it's probably worth saying at this stage, there is a very wide range of qualities of housing officers. Some housing officers are genuinely great and they will give you a good service. They will not make you feel uncomfortable, even if there are difficult discussions to be had. And there are some outright sadists out there. And probably more than that, there's a lot of people who are just, they just turn up 9 AM, they try and avoid as much work as possible during the day, and then they go home again, and they don't really kind of connect the fact that they are depriving people of housing unlawfully. So you've got a real kind of range, and so it's a real kind of potluck really, whether you get a decent officer or not. So that's the kind of overview of what you're kind of up against. And so I thought in this video I'm just going to separate it out into things you need to do before the interview or the assessment, things you need to do during the interview, and things you need to do afterwards, just to kind of make it as logical as possible. And I'd say hopefully you've got a little bit of time to kind of prepare for this. As I say, it's often going to be a couple of weeks. It might have actually been you've known about the homeless application for a little bit of time anyway, so you can kind of have that time to prepare. And there's certainly a lot of homework that you can do in preparation for it. So I would suggest that you try to read the housing allocation policy for that council. Not because a lot of it won't be relevant, because a lot of it won't be about homeless applications, but there will be stuff in there about banding, stuff in about location, all that sort of stuff. When you read it, you need to understand that that's primarily about Part 6 of the Housing Act, so they might use definitions like 2 or 3 or 10-year local connection criteria, when actually with the homeless application process it's only potentially as little as 6 months or even less than that sometimes. So do check out again the video I did about local connection to understand how that works. So that's the setup. So you kind of read the policies. If there's any other information you can get your hands on, if there are other people who've been through the process, speak to them, because this is a legal process and obviously there's a huge amount riding on it. So I would consider it's probably something along the same lines as like a HR meeting if you're employment, or a divorce proceeding, something like that. Again, there's a lot of stakes involved, and you're up against people whose day job is doing this probably multiple times a day. So they are much more knowledgeable than you. They also know how to break the law and kind of do it subtly, so certainly a lot of the time. So that's the kind of situation you're in. So in the same way that you wouldn't dream of wandering into a HR meeting ill prepared, it's the same kind of idea for this. And again, I'd say there's more riding on this than there will be on a HR meeting. So there's a lot of things that you want to kind of think about before in advance. One of the key things is going to be finding a friend or advocate to come and sit in that meeting with you. Those meetings will often be very intimidating anyway, even if there's a nice officer, and there's a whole bunch of stuff which will happen very quickly that might have some long-term significance to it. So having someone there with you can certainly kind of make you feel more assured. And also, ideally you want to find someone who has some sort of experience in these kinds of meetings. It's not unusual for people to be brought into, Friends HR meetings. So I've certainly attended Friends HR meetings before, just to sit there, ask a couple of questions, but crucially, take as many notes as is humanly possible. So that friend or advocate needs to be sitting there in the meeting with you, furiously writing down as much as they possibly can do. Because if nothing else, that says to the housing officer, okay, we're up against someone here who actually kind of has some idea of what they're doing, and essentially what I'm saying here, I might be held to account for it later. Because going back to that kind of overarching thing, there is a massive power imbalance between the housing officer and the homeless person, and anything you can do to kind of readjust that balance is going to be useful. And having someone there who's competent, potentially, maybe works, as I say, in a profession where they're used to this kind of meeting, is going to really kind of help you out. I have seen situations where even local government councillors, the kind of councillors that you elect, would come into a meeting with someone just to kind of sit there. Many of the times I've sat there in meetings with people, because I've known the council by then fairly well, I haven't actually had to do much. Just the fact that you're there massively increases the chance of getting a good outcome. And I might as well just quote a really cool stat from when I worked at Just Us. When we divided, so Just Us is a little charity in Bedford that we set up, me and John Allen, still going, just kind of works with people in Bedford Borough. But basically, when we divided our clients into two columns, a column of people who went to the council on their own in the first instance, and people who went to the council with an advocate, as in us, 86% of the time they went on their own, they were told there was no duty to house them when there actually was. And we knew there actually was because we went back and got them housed. So it wasn't like, it wasn't mysterious. We just went and did it. Whereas when we went with them from the start, it was only 12%. So just by being there, having someone with you who is just writing notes, who the council officer knows is going to kind of bring them up on things that aren't right, that is going to massively change the odds of you getting a good outcome. Another thing to kind of do in advance is to send as much information as you possibly can. So in that video I did about making a homeless application, I basically said any information that you do have to hand, attach it to that initial email. Now, often the housing officer won't actually read it, so you might have to take it with you again. But anything you can get, address history with postcodes and all the kind of details of addresses, landlords, all that sort of thing, you're going to be asked about. Things like medical letters, all those kind of things, proof of medication, all of those kind of things. Your smart app, your NHS app on your smartphone, just to show if you need it. All of that stuff is going to help it run smoother. And effectively, the good housing officers will thank you for it. If you're basically kind of making their job easier, then that's going to be a good thing, and actually kind of sets up that relationship in a far more productive manner. Because bottom line is, housing officers are human. They will have their favourites, and they will treat people differently according to a number of different factors, including prejudice. But the fact that you're going in there and providing information quickly as possible is going to look good on you and probably help you out. You might also want to just prepare some questions in advance. So things about, where's the temporary accommodation going to be? What sort of accommodation is going to be? How long is it going to take? These are all very valid questions. Now, the housing officer might not be able to give you an answer on some of that, but it's good to ask those questions anyway. Even the kind of, fine details about how do you bid, who do I contact if I need someone? All of those kind of things are good to know, because in one sense, once that interview ends, you're going to struggle to get hold of your housing officer ever again. They are inundated with work, they're swamped, but that hour or so you're going to sit in a room with them is your best opportunity to get that information that you're going to need, because you have them right there and then, and it doesn't take actually any time to respond in those circumstances. Now, if you have a disability, you want to make it very clear, as I say, you want to make it clear in the initial email anyway that you triggered a homeless application with, because it's going to have far-reaching consequences. Obvious example is a wheelchair user would need wheelchair accessible temporary accommodation. But there might be other disabilities that you might have, let's say ADHD or autism or something like that, which is going to have an impact on how that meeting is undertaken. I mean, it might be an issue which means you struggle to take in lots of information all at once. So these are things you want to kind of tell the housing officer about beforehand. And it might be you say, do you know what, I've got ADHD, I struggle to take information in, I might need a couple of short breaks, just to get a bit of fresh air during the meeting if I get stressed out or if I kind of feel overwhelmed. Those are all entirely valid things to do, so you just need to tell the council that that's what's happening. You might also want to request a particular gender housing officer. So let's say, for example, you're experiencing domestic abuse, you're female, you might prefer to have a female officer. The Homelessness Code of Guidance does actually specify you can specifically ask for a female officer in that environment. But you might also just want to ask for a female officer or a male officer anyway, because it might be there are other issues you want to talk about which you feel more confident and comfortable talking with in that kind of environment with someone of the same gender as you. I mean, so to be controversial, to be honest, over the years, I would say that male housing officers are, just as likely to be good as female housing officers. Generally speaking, I've seen some really hard and kind of sadistic female officers, if I'm honest. So just having a female officer in itself isn't necessarily going to mean that they're really nice and kind of friendly or whatever. In some situations, it seems that they kind of can be even harder and kind of colder, but yeah, that's another issue. That bit's just definitely my opinion, by the way, but that's how I see it. And the final thing I'd say about preparation for the meeting is that go in with an open mind as much as you can. Obviously, I'm coming from the point of view of seeing where it's gone wrong over many years, so I obviously only see the real negatives, or mainly only see the negatives of housing officers. Some housing officers genuinely are good, and I do get to work with them occasionally as well, but I'm guessing if you've come and looked for this video on YouTube, it's likely that you've already probably had reason to suspect that things aren't going to be quite as fair and as smooth as they should be. But go in with an open mind as soon as you can, and try to go in there trying to be friendly, trying to be open with the housing officer, and just try and remember that they are up against it. They are having a difficult work time or whatever. Try and just kind of sympathise with that as much as you can. You don't have to, but I'd say just kind of try and garner that kind of rapport as much as you can. They are going to have to ask you some unpleasant questions, and I guess just kind of trying to be open with that and trying to be kind of fair with that is going to help you out, I guess, down the line. So once you've done this preparation, you're on the day, you're turning up in 15 minutes beforehand or whatever, just to make sure you're there on time. Now, councils generally use private interview rooms for these types of assessments, although not always. So Bedford Borough Council, it's a live issue at the moment for us, because at the moment they seem to be using the Open Plan Customer Service Centre to conduct these highly sensitive homelessness assessments. And we raised it with the council before many years ago, got it sorted out, and they've now regressed back to this practice of having these meetings in a setting where lots of people can overhear you. So if you don't get taken to a private interview room where at least there's kind of sound insulation or whatever, so people can't hear you, then you can absolutely request it, and you would absolutely be within your rights to refuse to talk in an open plan customer service centre. I appreciate that's very difficult to do in the real world, but that's a legal requirement. They have a legal requirement to make sure their practices are data protection compliant by design and defaults. What that basically means is they should be able to have a conversation with you about highly sensitive stuff without anyone else hearing that doesn't need to hear. So that's something you need to be aware of. Most private interview rooms I've been in with in different councils will be quite small, will be quite cramped. You might struggle to get two other people in there, for example, if you're taking, maybe you're taking your baby or something and an advocate. But that's going to be the way it is. You're going to be crammed in there. It's going to be quite cold and an unpleasant environment a lot of the time. And so that's just kind of just be prepared for that. Some people feel claustrophobic in those environments, but just kind of do what you can do. So you get taken through. Don't be surprised if they're running late already. It's a bit like doctor surgeries. They're kind of inundated, and they might just be running behind schedule. So don't go in with a kind of pissed off about it. Just go in and just understand that they're trying to do as best they can. And after you've done the introduction, I would say you might want to consider to ask the housing officer if they're happy with you recording an audio of the meeting. Now, there are lots of reasons why you might want to do that. You might struggle to take information in. I think most people would struggle to take the amount of information in you're going to need to process in that time. Now, housing officers won't like you for doing that, so it's just worth bearing in mind, is it worth pissing them off? But remember, they're public officers discharging a public duty, a public legal duty. They should not be surprised if they are recorded. It's a bit like police officers. You can record a police officer because they are public officers. And the same would go for housing officers. Now, personally, and this is only my opinion, if I was in that situation, I would not ask them. I would just covertly record it on my phone, kind of out of sight or whatever. That's legal, as long as you don't go and share it widely or something, or share it at all, really. But that just kind of provides you with an account of what was actually said, how much information was kind of given to you, and also if there is some skullduggery going on, then you can then kind of raise it later on down the complaints process if the housing officer's denying they said something, which clearly they did say. So that's just me. I would record it. I appreciate a lot of people might feel kind of that's distasteful. It is distasteful, but that's again, you're trying to protect the rights that you have as a citizen. So I would say that's kind of what needs to happen. I work within councils and I know how dishonest some housing officers are, and that's why I would go in with a covert recording device. But again, that's going to be down to you whether you want to do that or not. Either way, your advocate or friend that you've gone in with needs to have a notebook with lots of pages, and they immediately just need to start writing. Name of the housing officer, the date, time, all of those kind of things, a detailed kind of account of what questions were asked, what information was given back. As arduous as that is, it is going to massively improve the chances of you being treated fairly. So you need to kind of tell your advocate or your friend that's what they need to do. They just need to be seen to be furiously writing down everything the housing officer is saying and a summary of what you're saying in response. Now, the housing officer will also be taking notes, and the housing officer might say things like, "Oh, you don't need to take notes. I'm taking notes." Just say, that's really, that's fine. That's really good. You're taking notes, but I just want to take notes from my own memory and stuff. And you can then write them up after the meeting and send them back to the housing officer, just so you've got an accurate account of what was said and what wasn't said. As I say, there are going to be some highly sensitive things the housing officer does legitimately need to ask you. However, there are also highly sensitive things the housing officer will ask you that they don't need to ask at all. So if, for example, you are already in priority need because you have children, then they are going to need less information about your medical history, for example. They might still need to know stuff about it because it might be you need a particular type of accommodation or something like that. But it's basically, they have a generic set of questions to ask. If they're asking the ins and outs of your mental health treatment, you are absolutely at liberty to say, why do you need to know that? And they might give you a fair answer, in which case provide the information. But as I say, their default might be to take more information than they should do, which again is actually a breach of the Data Protection Act, but that's a whole other story. So do feel free to kind of gently challenge them. So a good way to challenge a housing officer is not to say, "You're wrong." You could just literally say, I've been looking on the shelter website and, they seem to say that this was the case, but you're saying this is the case. Can you just explain to me how that makes sense? And then the housing officer is not painted into a corner. They can kind of say, actually, do you know what, you've misunderstood that slightly. Here's what the actual answer is. Again, your friend is going to be taking notes and all that. But it's just a more gentle way to challenge things rather than saying, you're wrong. On that line, in my experience, there is no point having an argument verbally with a housing officer in a meeting. Now, I can go into the psychology of this. Stanley Milgram did a lot of stuff on this in his kind of work around the agentic state. So when you're dealing with a bureaucrat in a particular setting, there is no telling them that they're wrong, even if they're clearly wrong. And housing officers' training levels mean that they often will be wrong. They just won't know what they're talking about. But having an argument with them there and then is just not going to in any way sort it out. It's almost like they're psychologically trapped in whatever their stupid stuff they say. So the best way to kind of deal with that sort of thing is to get your friend to write up the notes of what's saying. You can ask questions, open questions. Can you explain that in a bit more detail to me? I'll give you a couple of examples. Now, this example you might have heard me talk about before on the channel because it was just ridiculous. But basically, my colleague John, who works at Just Us, went in with a lady who was fleeing domestic abuse, and she was something like 30 weeks pregnant, so visibly pregnant. And went in, they told the situation to the housing officer. The housing officer we already knew the housing officer was dodgy. We'd already raised a number of concerns about them. Her colleagues seemed to know that, our concerns were valid because they were sort of saying, do you know what, we've got concerns as well. And so John went in there and, the lady says, "I'm pregnant." And the housing officer basically pulls out a drawer, pulls out a pregnancy test and says, "Right, go do this in the customer service centre toilets." And John, in my opinion, correctly said, "Let's not argue with her. If you feel like you can do that, go and do it and bring it back, and then we'll continue." So lady does it, comes back, it's positive. Then the housing officer says, I need to see your midwife book. Bedford it's green, but other areas it might be different. But, you get a book from your midwife that kind of charts your pregnancy as you go through it. And again, she didn't legally need to provide that. But John said, "Look, let's just get through it. Let's not argue with the housing officer. Let's get a roof over your head and we'll complain about it later." So they do it, they bring it back, and then the housing officer says she wants a scan photo. Now that is unlawful for a number of different reasons, but when you're in that setting and your priority is to get a roof over someone's head, I would suggest that you just ride it out. And as John did in that situation, after the meeting he then made a complaint, kind of on all the different things, which was upheld. And the housing officer didn't last for much longer, although lasted a lot longer than she should have, in my opinion. So that's just one example. I'm trying to think of another one. So interesting bit of feedback I got when I worked at Just Us. So when we got someone housed, we'd sit down with them for a coffee and ask them about what went well, what didn't go well. And I'd gone in with another lady who was a victim of domestic abuse actually, and I knew the housing officer we were dealing with. She was a bit of a nightmare, and basically because I had this kind of default position that I wouldn't argue verbally in the meeting because in my experience it just doesn't work, I sat there in silence, and the victim was asked, but he's not actually hit you though, why didn't you leave before, why are you doing it now, why didn't you do it a year ago, all that kind of stuff, why didn't you flee a year ago, that kind of question. And because, yeah, even though it was unlawful, because I was, just thinking, okay, I'm just going to get through this and get a roof over our head, I just stayed silent. And after the meeting, but we got it sorted out. She got compensation actually for a number of failures. But the exit interview we did a few months later when she was housed, she said that the fact I'd been silent in that meeting had just made it even more difficult. Like, I was basically almost like, kind of saying that the housing officer's actions were correct. So that was an interesting point as a professional. From that point, I've always clear that I will always say something, even if I don't get into a full-on argument with a housing officer. I will say something and just say, I don't think that's the law. I don't think you legally can ask that question. But let's continue. We can deal with that stuff later. So that's something that's kind of worth bearing in mind. As I say, some housing officers are great. And you don't need to worry about this. Another situation which might seem too weird to believe. I went in yet another survivor of domestic abuse, actually, very well-known perpetrator, really kind of high-level stuff, and she'd fled from a neighbouring borough. And the very first thing the housing officer said to her was, "Why have you come here? Why don't you go back to your home area?" And the reason was obvious. And I kind of went back to her and said, first of all, you can't ask that. Secondly, she's got a right to apply anywhere she wants. And I then had to ask the housing officer to stop scowling at her, because she was literally shooting the most ridiculously dirty looks all through the interview. Luckily, the survivor was just, kind of pretty robust and kind of dealt with it. But I just literally had to kind of pipe up and say, you just need to actually, check yourself and actually act professionally in this situation. So you do kind of have those situations that crop up as well. But generally speaking, try and deal with the conflict afterwards. If the housing officer's breaking the law and you know that they're breaking the law, still just try to get through it, provide the information, because it's much more likely you'll get a good outcome afterwards via writing emails and stuff rather than trying to have it out with them there and then. I've only had one housing officer ever who I corrected them and they paused. They went off to go and get a textbook basically and check what I was saying was right, and they came back and said, "Oh no, fair enough, you're right," and kind of proceeded differently. In every other situation I've ever been in, I've lost count of how many arguments I've had with housing officers or kind of these settings I've been in. They'll just dig their heels in. They'll paint themselves into a corner. They'll say stupid stuff, increasingly stupid stuff, and the only way you can then kind of unpick yourself is by a complaint down the line. So as much as you can, try to avoid that situation kind of escalating in the meeting. As I say, sometimes it's not always easy, but that's the way it is. As I say, you've already gone there with all the information. You will be asked standard stuff about proof of address history, that sort of thing. And the more information you can provide there and then, the better. Ideally, often the housing officer will go off with a load of paperwork and photocopy it for later or whatever, so you've then got it. So that's going to help everything out down the line. So try to provide as much information as you can. But just remember that legally, it's the housing officer's job to make the inquiry. So if you're saying you have a medical condition and you don't have any medical letters, legally speaking, it's the housing officer's job to contact your GP to prove it or not. It's not your job, certainly not your job to go and get a letter from your doctor. I mean, you might have some medication on you or something like that just to provide some evidence, but you shouldn't need to. The threshold that you're working on here is low, so just bear that in mind. As I've said already, if it's getting too much, feel free to take a breather. Just say, look, can you just give me 2 minutes? A decent housing officer will say, yeah, that's fine. They've got lots of admin to do anyway, so they kind of write up notes and stuff. But do take that time just to get your head straight and whatever before you go back in, because it is arduous. It might only be an hour, but it's a tough hour. They will be suspicious of you. They will be often disbelieving what you've said by default. That kind of situation is difficult to kind of deal with. So don't think it's you're weak or something if you need to go and get a bit of time just to kind of dust yourself down and kind of come back into it. You want us to ask some questions. In one sense, you might have already prepared some questions in advance, but ask those questions there and then. As I say, things like timescale, and crucially, just write down what the housing officer says. And you want to kind of be in that situation where you're saying, look, I need to do X, Y, and Z. I need to go and get a bank statement. I need to go and do, get some ID or something. I will do that by, 3 days. That will be enough time. And then you're kind of inviting the housing officer to say, okay, yeah, they'll do X, Y, and Z by, whatever, A, B, and C dates as well. So you've kind of got that clear understanding of what is going to happen when. Now, housing officers often will kind of get overwhelmed and kind of not comply with those time limits, but it's just a good practice kind of way of just saying, look, I'm going to do what I need to do. I've got actions to do. I need to go and do some stuff. You need to do some stuff. This is when we're going to do it by, and then we kind of go on that basis. And the final thing I'd say about this is when you're having these conversations or these assessment processes, just bear in mind that the housing officer does not need to prove beyond all reasonable doubt that you are homeless and that you are in priority need. They only need to be satisfied that on the balance of probability that that's the case. So the Code of Guidance talks about, there's no need to carry out detailed CID type inquiries. The housing officer just needs to be satisfied. So if someone says, I'm pregnant, they look pregnant, that's probably enough to be satisfied that they are in fact pregnant. You know, housing officer might want to just contact the midwife just to kind of check it off. This idea that you need to provide ridiculous amounts of evidence just to prove very simple points is evidence that it's a bit of a red flag that the housing officer is a bit of a perp and is just kind of, you know, looking to screw you over. So probably still have to play ball with them in the interview, but just kind of bear in mind, again, with that note-taking stuff that your friend is doing, you want to just kind of ask, you know, the housing officer asked for pregnancy test and green book and a scan photo, all of those kind of things, because those can form the basis of a complaint afterwards, should you choose to want to pursue it. That's as many things as I can think of to talk about. I mean, I didn't actually mention, in kind of forming this list of things to do, I did go and ask a bunch of people I've kind of contact with, and it's kind of an amalgamation of the advice they gave back. The final thing I'd say about what you do on the day is that when you come out of that interview room, just go easy on yourself, go take a bit of time, do whatever you need to do just to get a bit of a break, because it is hard. So don't plan an intense day that day. You're probably just going to need to take some time just to unwind and kind of, just get over the emotions that you may well have felt during that interview process. You probably want to make a note, write up those notes as soon as possible, as in same day, in my opinion. Again, you might think you've got through the worst of it, and you have, but you'd still need to write those notes up. You still need to have them typed up, nice and clear. You know, you talk to your friend, you make sure that, your memory's all good, because in 7 days' time or in a month's time, you will not remember the things you think you'll remember. So having those notes done on the same day just means it's fresh. And a few things to do after the meeting as well is that you want to email those notes to the housing officer and say, look, here are my notes, can you just check through them for accuracy's sake? And it's probably going to be several pages of notes, but that just gives you opportunity, again, just to provide additional information, because the housing officer's notes would probably not be as kind of as detailed as your friend's notes if they've been doing nothing but writing. So yeah, that kind of bear that in mind as well. So you've then got, once you've emailed it, you've got a written record of what was and wasn't said. So if the housing officer doesn't correct you, you can kind of rely on what was in those notes after the date. It's contemporaneous notes. So contemporaneous is just a fancy word for things which you've done at the time. Contemporaneous notes mean a lot, which again is why you need to do them on the same day if you can, rather than a month's time. Because if you ever go down the complaint process, for example, and it ends up in front of the local government and social care ombudsman, one of the things they'll look at is how contemporaneous are these notes. And if you can show you made the notes on the same day, that is good evidence of what happened. The housing officer might not get to write their notes up for some time, and the fact that you've done it on the same day means essentially your memory or your notes are seen to be more accurate than the housing officer's by default. Now obviously there's exceptions to that, but that kind of gives you an idea of why it's so important. You might also just want to kind of take some other notes as well about how you're feeling. So again, it's as difficult as it is to sort of face negative emotions, it's probably helpful just to say how you feel. You leaving that room, you feel like it went well, or you feel like the housing officer was unfair, it feels like the housing officer didn't believe you, feels like the housing officer was asking too much information. Those things, your gut and your instinct there will be very good at kind of giving an idea of like how the housing officer was approaching it in general. So it's also good to do that. And you might at this point want to just kind of list out bullet points of all the things you think the interview got wrong. What went wrong, what wasn't asked, what was asked that wasn't correct, what was said that wasn't correct, all of those kind of things. Because again, if you're ever having to make a complaint about this down the line, those kind of things will matter. And that kind of detail will give you a good, put you in a good position to kind of make a good complaint. And finally, as I've sort of said in the middle bit, you've set these timescales about what you're going to do, and the housing officer set timescales about what they're going to do. You need to stick to those timescales. If you said you're going to get the bank statements in 2 days, you better get down your bank and provide those bank statements, or get on your phone or whatever. You want to give the housing officer no excuse to delay it. And if they have got one outstanding document, that could be the difference between you getting onto the housing register in time to get social housing and ending up in private rented accommodation. So the quicker you can get that information out, the highest the chance will be of you getting social housing at the end of all of this. So that's just kind of bear in mind as well. But other than that, I think that's, I'm sure there are other things to say about this kind of idea, but I think that will give you a good idea of kind of how it all works. I would say the single most important thing is about having a good friend, a good reliable friend who is hopefully experienced in some sort of setting of kind of the law, kind of those sorts of meetings, because that will just kind of level the playing field as much as possible. And other than that, the quality of your notes is going to be a massive thing as well. And it might be that after the date, you remember things you need to say as well, so just email them across. but that should kind of maximise the chance of, first of all, being dealt with fairly, and by virtue of being treated fairly, that maximises the chance of the council actually providing a roof over your head.